Thick clouds hung low over the valley, casting an eerie twilight that seemed frozen in time. The road leading down into the valley was barely a path, overgrown with twisted, thorny bushes that clawed at the few travelers who dared make their way here. A chill in the air pressed down like an invisible weight, sinking deep into the bones. Birds, if there were any, had long since fallen silent, and even the faint breeze felt as if it carried whispers rather than wind. As the solitary figure descended, each footstep echoed dully, muffled by a layer of damp leaves that coated the ground. This was no ordinary traveler. He was a man with an unquenchable curiosity, the kind that pulled at him even in the dead of night, tugging him toward answers he often wished he could unlearn. He had heard stories, vague, shadowed tales from locals too afraid to say much, but their silences spoke louder than words. No one ventured willingly into the valley, not without reason. And his reason, well, it was the thirst to see the truth behind those hushed words. The valley opened like a yawning mouth before him, lined with skeletal trees whose branches stretched toward the sky in crooked, bony fingers. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, as if unseen eyes followed his every move. It wasn't mere paranoia. Something in this place seemed to breathe, pulsating with a silent menace that gnawed at his composure. His steps slowed almost involuntarily as he took in his surroundings. Every rock, every shrub seemed to possess a sinister edge, a hidden secret waiting to unfold. As he ventured deeper, the dim light became even scarcer. A faint mist clung to the ground, swirling around his ankles and snaking through the trees. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tightly around him to stave off the chill. He remembered the warning, spoken in a raspy, frightened voice by an old man at the village's edge. "Don't go looking for what you can't unsee. The valley's taken more souls than you'd care to know." It had sounded like the stuff of old wives' tales at the time, a superstitious warning he was far too practical to heed. But here, surrounded by shadow and silence, those words returned, echoing like an unwanted memory. A rustling sound broke the quiet. He froze, scanning the tree line. The sound was faint, almost like the dragging of fabric against the ground. He waited, holding his breath. But nothing followed, only the thick, unyielding silence. It was as if the very air had paused, waiting for something unseen to resume. The man exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He pressed on, feeling the valley closing in around him, each step heavier than the last. It was difficult to tell where he was going. There were no paths here, no worn trails to guide him. It was as if the valley had been untouched for centuries, preserved in some forgotten shadow of time. Then, in the corner of his eye, he noticed something glinting faintly among the leaves. Kneeling, he brushed the debris aside, revealing a weathered locket, the metal tarnished and cold to the touch. Turning it over, he noticed it bore strange, barely legible etchings. Symbols he didn't recognize lined the surface, carved deep into the metal as though marking something significant. A chill raced down his spine, and he slipped the locket into his pocket, unsure why he was compelled to take it, but feeling it belonged with him now. The sense of being watched intensified, prickling the hairs on his neck. He straightened slowly, casting one last glance around him. The valley seemed darker now, the trees taller, shadows longer and deeper. With a tightening in his chest, he realized that whatever lay hidden here was not keen on sharing its secrets. But he was already too far in, and something deeper than curiosity urged him forward. As he rose to his feet, the air around him felt denser, as though he had somehow crossed an invisible threshold deeper into the valley's hidden heart. The locket in his pocket felt heavier than it should, its presence a cold reminder pressing against his thigh with every step. He tried to shake off the unease, rationalizing that it was just the weight of the valley's history pressing on him, not anything tangible. Yet his fingers still drifted to the locket absent-mindedly, tracing its strange etchings through the fabric of his coat. The trees here seemed older, twisted into unnatural shapes that defied reason. Their branches wove into a canopy so thick that barely a sliver of light seeped through, casting the forest floor into near darkness. Shadows moved along the periphery of his vision, and every now and then he thought he saw faint impressions in the damp soil. Shapes resembling footprints, larger and deeper than any human foot might make. But each time he looked closer, the marks vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself, leaving him wondering if his mind was already playing tricks on him. A faint, earthy smell filled the air, something between rotting leaves and wet stone, tinged with a sour note that prickled his nose. It was unlike anything he'd ever encountered, as though the valley itself exhaled decay. He began to notice something peculiar. The trees bore marks similar to the symbols on the locket. Roughly carved into bark, these shapes resembled twisted spirals, odd crosses, and circles, arranged in a pattern that suggested purpose, as if they marked the way deeper into the valley. As he traced his fingers over one of the carvings, a strange sensation crawled over his skin, like a static charge that sent prickles of discomfort across his hand. The symbol felt cold and oddly slick, and he recoiled instinctively. Whatever force lingered here, it was as old as the valley and woven into its very roots. He felt an irrational urge to step back, to turn around and leave the strange carvings behind. But something deeper than curiosity, a stubborn streak that often drove him into these dark corners, pushed him to press on. A distant sound broke the silence, faint but unmistakable, the echo of a woman's laughter, delicate and haunting. It drifted through the trees like a feather on the wind, hollow and unsettling. His heart skipped, and he turned, straining to see beyond the curtain of shadows. There was no sign of anyone. The laughter trailed off, fading into the same silence, but its memory lingered, woven into the very air around him. Suddenly, his throat felt dry, and he regretted not bringing water. Every breath was a struggle, as if the valley's atmosphere had thickened, pressing down on his lungs. He pressed forward, though his pulse quickened with each step. As he moved, he spotted another glint on the ground, something half buried in the mud. It was a weathered coin, tarnished and ancient, with symbols on its surface that mirrored those on the trees and the locket. He picked it up, feeling the cold metal against his skin, and pocketed it next to the locket. The forest seemed to deepen with each step, drawing him further in like an inescapable web. He couldn't tell if he was walking in circles or if the valley was subtly shifting around him, a living labyrinth designed to trap the curious. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he no longer heard any sounds, not even his own footsteps, which now felt muted, swallowed by the earth beneath him. For a moment, a primal fear rose within him. His mind whispered that he should leave, turn back, that he had already ventured too far into a place meant to be forgotten. But the weight of the valley's dark pull kept him rooted, even as the whispers returned, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably real. Whatever was lurking in the heart of this valley knew he was here, and it was waiting. He stood there, gripping the coin as his eyes darted around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. The laughter had long faded, yet its chilling echo lingered in his mind, entwining with the valley's quiet. A creeping dread took root in him, a sense that he was trespassing somewhere sacred, somewhere dark. The thought of leaving returned, clearer now, like an insistent voice prodding him to turn back. But he couldn't. Not yet. Pushing forward, he tried to steady his breathing, forcing himself to focus on the path, or what remained of it. The twisted trees closed in around him, their branches like gnarled hands clawing toward the sky, casting jagged, unsettling shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. His boots crunched over twigs and dead leaves, the sounds strangely muffled, as if the valley were swallowing any trace of his presence. The mist around his feet grew thicker, curling and shifting with an almost sentient quality. It clung to his ankles, winding up his legs in slow, ghostly tendrils. He felt its damp chill seeping through his clothing, reaching into his bones. There was something deeply unnatural about it, a dampness that felt alive, like cold fingers trailing up his skin. He quickened his pace, eager to leave the mist behind, but it followed, matching his every step. Ahead, through a thin break in the trees, he spotted a strange shape, barely visible in the murky light. His heart quickened. It was an old stone structure, half buried and nearly reclaimed by the forest. Weathered and overgrown with moss, it looked like some ancient altar or marker, as if it had stood there for centuries, defying time. He approached it cautiously, each step more hesitant than the last. The stone was covered in the same symbols that marked the trees, carved deep into its surface in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. He traced a finger over them, feeling the rough grooves beneath his touch. They felt colder than the surrounding stone, an unnatural chill that prickled against his skin. It was as if the symbols themselves were a warning or a curse, a barrier meant to contain something or keep something out. A faint hum, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the stone, vibrating through his fingertips. It was a low, droning sound, like a heartbeat buried deep within the earth. He pulled his hand back, unnerved by the sensation, but the hum continued, faint and persistent, reverberating in his chest as if his own heartbeat had synchronized with it. Suddenly, he became aware of another presence. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. A weight pressing down on him, an intense awareness that sent every nerve in his body on edge. It was close. Too close. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, a sharp tang that lingered on his tongue and coated the back of his throat. He turned slowly, his gaze darting into the depths of the forest, searching for any hint of movement. The shadows seemed thicker now, solid and impenetrable, and within them, he thought he saw something. A pair of eyes, perhaps, glinting faintly from the darkness, like embers smoldering in the depths of a forgotten fire. They watched him with a predatory stillness, unblinking and aware, as if assessing his every move. A wave of panic surged through him, cold and relentless, but he forced himself to stay calm. Running wasn't an option. He knew instinctively that whatever lurked in the shadows could move faster than he could. Instead, he took a single slow step backward, another, trying to distance himself from the stone and the eyes that seemed bound to it. But as he moved, he heard a rustling sound, faint at first, then growing louder. It wasn't the sound of leaves or branches. It was something dragging, scraping over the forest floor, inching closer with every passing second. The mist thickened, swirling up around him, and the whispers returned, clearer now, yet still indecipherable, a blend of voices speaking in tones both pleading and condemning. He swallowed hard, the chill sinking deeper into his chest. Whatever ancient force lay hidden here, it wasn't something that could be reasoned with or understood. It was watching, waiting, testing his resolve. He forced himself to take one more step back, heart pounding, but the whispers only grew louder, echoing through the valley in a relentless, haunting refrain. The whispers grew louder, like a symphony of murmurs resonating from the heart of the valley itself, weaving around him in haunting waves. They rose and fell, their tones blending into a chilling chorus that seemed to seep through his skin. Words teetered on the edge of comprehension, only to dissolve into unintelligible fragments that left him grappling with a dread he couldn't name. His throat tightened, and his pulse throbbed against his temples as he took another step back, his gaze never leaving the spot where those eyes had glimmered in the dark. But the eyes were gone, swallowed once again by the shadows. Only the sound of something dragging, a faint, rhythmic scrape, lingered, stirring his imagination into overdrive. The forest itself felt alive, its presence closing in around him with an oppressive force. He glanced back at the stone marker, half hoping it would offer some clue, some protection, but it now seemed to emanate an even colder aura. The carved symbols almost appeared to pulse, responding to the hum in the air, as though the valley were awakening around him. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the locket in his pocket, the metal frigid against his skin. The weight of it reminded him that he was carrying something from this place, something that may have bound him to it in ways he hadn't understood. He pulled it out, examining its intricate markings in the low, grayish light. Somehow, it felt as though the locket itself were alive, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the whispers. For a brief, horrifying moment, he wondered if he'd taken more than an object. If, in his careless curiosity, he had taken on some form of connection to the valley itself. The wind shifted, carrying a strange scent that made his stomach twist. It was no longer the earthy dampness of the forest, but something sharper, almost metallic, with an underlying staleness that hinted at decay. He tried to breathe shallowly, unwilling to let the scent invade his lungs, but it clung to him all the same, settling over him like a damp veil. Somewhere in the distance, a faint rustling began again, moving with an unnatural cadence, the sound circling him as if an unseen presence were spiraling closer. A flash of movement caught his eye, a pale blur slipping between the trees ahead. His breath hitched, and he instinctively took a step back, watching as the shape darted behind one of the twisted trunks and then emerged again, closer this time. It was low to the ground, a shadowy form moving with an eerie fluidity, too fast for him to make out any distinct features. But in those fleeting glimpses, he saw something wrong. The limbs were too long, unnaturally jointed, bending in ways that defied the limits of bone and muscle. And yet, it moved with a disturbing grace, its silhouette slipping through the trees as if part of the forest itself. He wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee from this unnatural thing that seemed to be closing in on him with calculated precision. But his legs felt leaden, paralyzed by a fear that took root deep within him, grounding him to the spot. He had the sudden, chilling realization that the valley was not merely home to this creature. It was its realm, a place where natural laws bent and twisted to suit its presence. He was an intruder here, an unwelcome guest in a world that followed its own dark rules. The creature paused, crouched low, its form barely visible in the shadows, but he could feel its eyes on him, piercing the darkness with an intensity that left him breathless. It was studying him, assessing, as if deciding what to make of this fragile, trembling figure who had dared to enter its territory. The whispers grew louder, and he wondered if they were urging the creature on, calling it closer, binding him tighter into the valley's sinister grip. In a desperate attempt to break the spell, he forced his legs to move, taking slow, deliberate steps backward, never breaking eye contact with the dark form that loomed just beyond the line of trees. But the creature matched his movements, gliding forward in silence, closing the distance with chilling ease. He felt the edge of panic scraping at his mind, and yet, even as he prepared to turn and run, the valley's strange magnetic pull held him, tightening around him like an invisible snare. It was then that he felt the cold metal of the locket growing even colder, almost searing against his palm. Without thinking, he raised it, clutching it tightly in front of him as if it were a talisman that could ward off whatever ancient force lay before him. To his shock, the creature halted, its form recoiling ever so slightly, as though the locket's presence disturbed it. He clung to that slim, fragile hope, feeling the faintest glimmer of power against the relentless shadows that surrounded him. But even as he held the locket aloft, he knew that whatever sanctuary it offered was only temporary. The creature's form lingered just beyond reach, its shadowy outline blending seamlessly with the twisted trees behind it. For a tense, breathless moment, everything was still. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath, as if watching to see what would unfold. The locket, now gripped so tightly in his hand that the edges pressed into his skin, throbbed with a faint, icy pulse, almost like a heartbeat. He clung to it, his fingers numb from the cold, hoping that whatever strange force lay within it might protect him. But then, with a shuddering realization, he felt the locket grow heavier, its weight no longer cold but strangely warm, as if absorbing something from the air around them. The creature flinched, retreating slightly into the shadows, but it did not flee. Instead, its gaze fixed on the locket with an intensity that seemed almost familiar. He could feel its curiosity, its hunger, something dark and ancient within it that recognized the small, worn object he held in his hand. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, and he could now make out fragments of words, disjointed and warped, but unmistakably human. They came in faint, distorted pleas, voices calling out from beyond, mingling together in a sorrowful dirge that reverberated in his mind. Words like lost, bound, and eternal surfaced in the flood of sound, resonating with a dreadful clarity. The voices seemed to draw him deeper into the valley, compelling him to understand, to listen. A part of him wanted to shut them out, to let the locket fall and abandon this strange, haunted place. But he couldn't move. His grip on the locket tightened, a silent promise to himself that he would see this through, even if it led him to places he'd never dreamed possible. He took a step forward, surprising even himself, and the creature tilted its head in a way that was both unsettling and almost aware. It watched him, its elongated limbs still as stone, as if waiting for him to make the next move. With a slight tremor in his voice, he managed to speak, unsure if he was talking to the creature, the valley, or even the voices. What are you?" he whispered, his words barely audible in the thick, oppressive silence. The creature responded not with words, but with a subtle, shivering motion, like the rustle of dry leaves caught in a faint wind. It slowly raised one of its long, misshapen arms, and for the first time he saw its hand, a strange clawed appendage that looked both fragile and terrifyingly strong. The hand hovered in the air between them, palm open, fingers extended as though reaching for the locket, or perhaps for him. An urge to run clawed at him, his instincts screaming to turn and flee, but the whispers held him in place. The voices grew softer, almost pleading, urging him not to fear, to trust, to listen. Trembling, he took a deep breath and extended the locket slightly toward the creature, wondering if this simple act might appease it or reveal some understanding. The creature's hand inched forward, its dark eyes glinting with an inscrutable expression. As the locket drew nearer, he felt something stir within him, a strange sensation of weightlessness, and yet an overwhelming heaviness in his chest. Images flickered in his mind, flashes of faces he'd never seen, places he'd never been. The scenes were vivid yet hauntingly incomplete, fragments of memories and emotions that he instinctively knew weren't his own. The locket, he realized, was a vessel, a container for something ancient and unresolved, bound to this valley by forces beyond his comprehension. The creature's claw finally brushed the locket, and the air around them erupted with a chilling, palpable energy. A dark light, if such a thing could exist, began to pulse from the locket, casting strange, dancing shadows on the forest floor. The creature's form seemed to flicker, its features shifting and warping as if struggling to hold on to its shape. The whispers grew louder, an anguished cry that sent shivers down his spine, echoing through the trees in waves of sorrow and rage. He watched, frozen, as the creature recoiled, releasing a guttural, almost human sound, a cry filled with a pain that transcended words. For a brief instant, he saw something in its dark, hollow eyes, a glimmer of emotion, a fragment of something almost recognizable. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it faded, leaving only the echo of that terrible cry, hanging in the air like a ghostly imprint. The locket fell silent in his hand, the dark light extinguished. He looked down at it, its surface now cold and ordinary, as though nothing strange had ever happened. But in the air around him, a profound stillness settled, a sense that something had shifted, something deep and irrevocable. The forest felt different now, as though it had drawn in a breath and was holding it, waiting. The creature had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only a faint impression in the mist and the lingering echo of that anguished cry. He stood alone in the oppressive quiet, the locket cold in his palm once more, though its weight now seemed heavier than ever. It was as if the object had taken on new gravity, holding the memory of whatever had just transpired within its metallic shell. He felt drained, his thoughts sluggish as he processed the encounter. The creature's cry lingered in his mind, its strange, mournful tone resonating with an unexpected clarity. It had been a sound born of something deeper than mere instinct. There had been recognition, even despair, laced in its wail. A shiver ran through him as he wondered if the creature was more than just a monster lurking in the dark, if it had once been something, someone, bound to this valley by forces far beyond his understanding. The mist swirled around his feet again, thick and damp, pressing against his ankles like cold fingers urging him to stay. He looked down, noticing once more the strange symbols carved into the ground around him, marking a faint circle that enclosed the stone altar he'd encountered earlier. They seemed to glow faintly now, an otherworldly shimmer that pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He felt a strange compulsion to follow them, the symbols forming a path that seemed to snake deeper into the forest, leading him towards some hidden destination. Against his better judgment, he began to walk, his steps light but purposeful. Each mark in the earth guided him forward, and he soon realized he was descending, moving deeper into the valley's core. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding close, their twisted trunks bending over the path as if conspiring to hide him from the outside world. It was a claustrophobic feeling, but he pressed on, gripped by an inexplicable sense of purpose that overrode his fear. As he walked, the whispers returned, no longer scattered and incoherent, but forming a haunting melody, a wordless chant that seemed to echo from the ground itself. The voices were sad, almost resigned, as if they were guiding him, but with heavy reluctance, mourning the path he had chosen to tread. He wanted to ask them why, to demand answers from these unseen presences, but he knew they would offer none. They were bound here just as he now was, trapped in the valley's timeless grasp. Soon he reached a clearing, its center dominated by a vast, yawning chasm. It looked unnatural, a gaping wound in the Earth's surface, as if some powerful force had torn it open ages ago. The edges of the chasm were smooth, almost polished, and the symbols that had guided him here lined its circumference, marking it as a place of great importance. The locket in his hand began to throb again, responding to the presence of the chasm with a pulsing urgency that made his skin crawl. He felt a pull toward the edge, an invisible force urging him to look down. Against every instinct screaming within him, he stepped forward, peering into the depths. The darkness within was thick, a living void that seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing the faint light that drifted down from the canopy above. And yet, as he stared, he began to make out faint shapes moving within it, shadowy figures shifting and twisting, as if they were trapped in some eternal dance. A sharp pang of sorrow gripped him, sudden and overwhelming. The shadows were people, or they had been once. He could feel their anguish as if it were his own, an ancient sorrow that seeped into his bones, filling him with a deep, aching despair. These were souls, bound to the valley, trapped within the chasm's depths, lingering in an endless cycle of torment. He staggered back, the weight of their suffering nearly bringing him to his knees. And then from within the chasm, a figure began to rise, slowly, emerging from the darkness like a specter breaching the surface of a midnight sea. It was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its presence was undeniable, powerful, and filled with a silent rage that sent icy shivers down his spine. He recognized it instantly. It was the creature, no longer bound to the forest shadows, but fully realized, drawn forth by his presence, by the locket, and by whatever power had awakened within this place. The air grew thick, heavy with a strange pressure that pressed down on him, forcing him to take shallow breaths. The creature hovered at the chasm's edge, its form flickering as though caught between worlds, a living remnant of the valley's dark history. Its gaze locked onto him, and he saw in its hollow eyes a mixture of anger and desperation, as if it were pleading for release, and yet bound by something far beyond either of their control. In that terrible moment, he understood. The creature was more than just a figure of fear. It was the valley itself, a guardian, a prisoner, and a judge. It had watched over this chasm for centuries, a sentinel cursed to remain in the dark recesses of the valley, bound to ensure that whatever lay within would never escape. And somehow, he had become part of that purpose, tied to the valley's ancient secrets, with the locket as his unwilling key. The creature's gaze bore into him, filled with a sorrow and rage so deep it seemed to stretch across lifetimes. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him, heavy and relentless, as though the very essence of the valley demanded something of him, an understanding, a choice, perhaps even a sacrifice. His fingers tightened around the locket, the cool metal grounding him against the tempest of emotions swirling around him. He was tethered here, bound by forces he was only beginning to grasp, and the valley would not let him leave until he fulfilled its demands. The creature's form flickered, shifting like smoke caught in an invisible wind, its edges blurring and reforming as if struggling to maintain its shape. He could feel its pain, an ancient, pulsing agony that resonated through his own body. For a fleeting moment, he caught glimpses of memories that weren't his, visions of lives spent in the valley, of people who had walked this path before him, each one drawn here by the same inexorable pull, and each one lost to the valley's endless hunger. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, and he understood now that they were not just sounds. They were fragments of those lost souls, lingering echoes caught in the valley's grasp, unable to find peace. They had come here seeking answers, just as he had, only to become part of the valley's dark history, trapped between life and death, their voices forever entwined with the chasm's depths. He looked at the creature, its eyes hollow yet brimming with the weight of countless lifetimes, and he realized that it too was one of them, a soul bound to the valley, transformed by its curse, doomed to guard this haunted ground for all eternity. Slowly, he extended his hand, the locket glinting in the faint, filtered light that seeped through the canopy above. The creature's eyes fixed on it, and he felt its hunger, its desperate need to be free of this place, to be released from the chains that bound it. He felt an overwhelming urge to give in, to hand over the locket and let it fulfill whatever purpose it held. But a whisper within him urged caution. A voice as soft as the wind, yet filled with an undeniable strength. He hesitated, torn between the creature's silent plea and the warning that reverberated deep within his soul. The locket held a power he did not fully understand, something ancient and potent that went beyond the valley's curse. It was a key, yes, but to what? Freedom? Or something far darker? He searched the creature's gaze, looking for an answer, but all he found was that same aching sorrow, an endless depth of pain that both drew him closer and held him back. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, the creature reached out, its clawed hands stretching toward him, fingers trembling with a need that was almost human. He felt a shiver pass through him, a surge of emotion so raw it left him breathless. There was a desperation in the creature's movements, a silent plea that spoke of loneliness, of an eternity spent in isolation, trapped in the shadows, bound to a duty that offered no respite. And in that moment, he realized that this creature was not just a monster. It was a prisoner, shackled to this valley just as he now was. Taking a deep breath, he allowed the locket to dangle between them, suspended by a thin chain that glinted in the dim light. The creature's gaze followed it, and he saw something flicker in its eyes, a spark of recognition, of hope, perhaps even of gratitude. It reached out, its clawed hand brushing against the metal, and he felt a sudden surge of energy, a connection forming between them, as if the locket served as a bridge between their worlds. But as the creature's fingers closed around the locket, he felt a jolt of resistance, a force pushing back against him. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices rising in protest, and he sensed that something powerful was awakening in response to the creature's touch. The chasm before him seemed to deepen, its darkness intensifying, and he realized with growing horror that he had disturbed something far older and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay, a sour, pungent odor that clawed at his throat. The creature's eyes widened, and for the first time, he saw fear flicker across its face. Whatever had been dormant within the valley was stirring now, and it was furious. He tried to pull the locket back, to break the connection, but the creature's grip was ironclad, its desperation now tinged with panic. He could feel the force in the chasm pulling at them both, an insatiable hunger that sought to draw them in, to consume them whole. The shadows around them seemed to come alive, stretching and writhing like living things, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers. As he struggled to free himself, he heard the whispers shift, their tone changing from protest to pleading, urging him to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But he was bound to the creature now, caught in a web of darkness that held him fast. He glanced into the creature's eyes one last time, seeing his own fear reflected back at him, and he knew then that he had unleashed something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The valley's curse had claimed him, and there would be no turning back. The darkness surged, twisting around them both, as if the valley itself had awakened with a furious hunger, ready to consume anything that dared disturb its slumber. He could feel the pull of the chasm intensifying, its depths a swirling black vortex that seemed to breathe, to pulse, as though it were alive. The creature's grip tightened on the locket, its fingers digging into the metal with such force he thought it might shatter, but its gaze remained locked on him, desperate and pleading, as if urging him to understand something crucial, something he couldn't yet grasp. The ground shuddered beneath them, cracks spiderwebbing out from the chasm's edge, dark fissures spilling mist that coiled around their feet like sentient tendrils. The mist crawled up his legs, wrapping itself around him in a freezing embrace, tightening with each passing moment. His breaths grew shallow, his chest heavy, as if the valley's weight was pressing down on him, demanding submission. He tried to wrench the locket back, but it seemed fused to the creature's grasp, the metal glowing faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the valley's heartbeat. A voice, deeper and more resonant than any he'd heard before, reverberated through his mind, echoing up from the chasm with a weight that felt as ancient as the earth itself. It wasn't a whisper, but a command, a voice that seemed to belong to something older than time, woven into the valley's very roots. Release or suffer the eternal bind. The words sent a chill through him, a primal fear he couldn't ignore. Yet he found himself rooted in place, caught between terror and a strange sense of responsibility. The creature's grip slackened slightly, and its hollow eyes flickered, its form wavering like smoke, as if it were on the edge of vanishing altogether. But it didn't let go. Its fingers remained curled around the locket, holding on with a kind of desperate defiance. He could feel its anguish, its need to escape the valley's prison, and in that moment he understood that the locket was not just a key, it was a vessel, binding the creature and its memories, its very essence to this cursed land. To release it might bring freedom, or it might unleash something darker. In a surge of resolve, he spoke, his voice rough and barely audible. "What are you bound to? What is this place to you?" The creature's eyes flickered, its hollow gaze briefly softening, almost as if it understood his question. Its mouth opened slightly, releasing a breath of mist, a faint whisper escaping its lips. Keeper, prisoner, guardian. The words hit him like a blow, and a wave of understanding washed over him, piecing together fragments of the valley's history. The creature was both guardian and captive, a warden of whatever dark force lay hidden in the chasm, bound to keep it from spilling into the world beyond. But now, with the locket, he had altered the balance, loosening the chains that had held it, and the creature at bay. Before he could react, the chasm roared to life, a guttural sound that rumbled up from its depths like the awakening of a buried beast. The mist around him thickened, pressing in, and he could feel a powerful force reaching up from the chasm, tendrils of darkness that sought to ensnare him, to bind him within the valley's curse. It was as if the valley itself were choosing a new guardian, seeking a soul to replace the creature, to take its place as the warden of this cursed ground. Panic flooded his veins as the realization hit him. He was in danger of becoming bound to this place, to the same torment that had held the creature for lifetimes. He struggled, trying to pull away, but the force was relentless, gripping him like iron chains. The locket burned in his hand, searing his skin, as though it, too, were fighting him, resisting his attempts to break free. He could feel the creature's sorrow, its resignation to its fate, as it held the locket in a final, desperate bid to free itself, even if it meant condemning him to take its place. The voices around him shifted again, their tone now pleading, entreating him to release the locket, to sever the connection before it was too late. But something inside him resisted. A strange sense of responsibility, of understanding that what he did now would determine the fate of the valley, the creature, and perhaps his own soul. The valley demanded a guardian, a soul to anchor its dark secrets, and he was caught in the terrible decision of whether to save himself or release the tortured soul beside him, even if it meant taking its place. The mist thickened into a shroud, closing around him, and the chasm seemed to pull at his spirit, drawing him into its boundless void. He glanced at the creature, whose gaze held a glimmer of something he hadn't seen before. Hope. It was a faint spark, but it burned brightly, and he knew then that his choice mattered, that he held the power to change both their fates. Trembling, he loosened his grip on the locket, his fingers shaking as he felt the valley's dark pull intensify, testing his resolve. With a final desperate breath, he wrenched the locket from the creature's grasp, holding it high as if to sever the invisible thread that bound them to the chasm's insatiable hunger. The valley shuddered in response, the air around him thick with a silent fury. The creature's form flickered, wavering, but its eyes met his, filled with a gratitude so deep it pierced his soul. Then slowly, the mist began to recede, the darkness around them fading as the valley's pull slackened, releasing him from its relentless grip. He stumbled back, clutching the locket, his chest heaving as he watched the creature begin to dissolve, its form merging with the shadows, finally free from the valley's hold. And as it faded, a faint smile curved its lips, a silent promise that he, too, had changed the course of their shared fate. The valley's whispers grew quiet, a peace settling over the land, leaving him alone with the weight of the locket, and the knowledge of what he had narrowly escaped. As the creature dissolved into the shadows, the valley exhaled, releasing a breath it had held for lifetimes. The mist retreated, curling back into the chasm as if some great unbreakable chain had finally snapped. The oppressive weight that had clung to him loosened, lifting like a dark shroud cast off by the dawn. He could feel the valley's ancient power withdrawing, settling back into the earth with a reluctant silence, leaving the forest in an eerie, almost reverent calm. His hands still shook as he looked down at the locket. It had cooled, the pulsating energy within it now a mere echo, as if whatever force it held had quieted, finally at rest. He examined it closely, noting how the intricate symbols carved into its surface had dimmed, losing the faint glow they had once emitted. The locket was heavy in his palm, but it felt different now, less like a vessel of torment, more like a relic, a memento from a place that had almost claimed his soul. He slipped it into his pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle against him, and took a tentative step back from the chasm's edge. The forest was silent, the trees unmoving, their twisted branches hanging heavy in the air. It was as if the entire valley were in mourning, grieving the creature it had lost and the balance that had been altered. Yet, beneath the sorrow, there was an undeniable sense of release, a relinquishing of a burden that had been carried for too long. He could feel it in his bones, a deep-rooted weariness that had stretched across ages, now free to dissolve into the soil, mingling with the roots and stones of the valley floor. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and leaves. It was refreshing, almost cleansing, washing over him like a quiet benediction, a sign that he was no longer bound to the valley's dark pull. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, feeling his heartbeat slowly return to a steady rhythm. The weight of what he had experienced pressed upon him, each memory vivid and raw. The creature's final grateful gaze lingered in his mind, haunting him with the realization that he had played a part in freeing it, even if he hadn't fully understood what he was doing. Opening his eyes, he took a cautious step forward, testing the path. There was no resistance now, no invisible force pushing him back. It felt like the valley itself was inviting him to leave, urging him onward. He began to walk, his steps slow but determined, each one taking him farther from the chasm, from the ancient presence that had once kept him rooted in fear. The trees parted easily as he moved, their branches no longer clawing at him, but instead seeming to bow in quiet reverence, allowing him safe passage. Yet as he walked, a lingering question gnawed at him. He had freed the creature. Yes, but what of the valley? The voices, those countless lost souls, had quieted, their whispers fading to silence, but he could still feel them. Ghostly echoes drifting just beyond his reach, as if waiting, watching. He wondered if he had truly severed their connection, or if, like the locket, they remained bound in some way, tied to the valley's ancient curse. He resisted the urge to look back, feeling that to do so would only pull him into questions that had no answers. He reached the edge of the clearing, where the thick mist gave way to clearer skies, the forest thinning into a trail that led toward the valley's boundary. He could see faint patches of sunlight filtering through the trees, casting warm golden pools on the ground ahead. For the first time, the valley seemed almost beautiful, its dark majesty tempered by a newfound sense of calm. The tension that had hung so heavily here was gone, replaced by a silence that felt less like dread and more like peace. As he emerged from the forest, he glanced one last time over his shoulder, his gaze drifting back toward the chasm hidden within the trees. It lay hidden, a dark secret, nestled in the heart of the valley, but it no longer held the same ominous power over him. He felt a quiet respect for the place, a reverence for the forces he had encountered, and an understanding that some mysteries were best left undisturbed. The valley would remain, a relic of shadows and ancient power, but its pull over him had finally broken. He turned away, following the path back to where he'd begun, his steps lighter now, unburdened. The locket pressed against his chest, a silent reminder of what he'd witnessed, what he'd endured. He knew he would never be the same, that the valley's dark influence had left an indelible mark on his soul. But he had been granted freedom, a second chance to walk away from the shadows and carry the lessons of the valley with him. With each step, he felt the world around him grow brighter, the weight of the past slipping further away, leaving only a faint echo that would live within him forever. And as he finally left the valley behind, he sensed that the creature, too, had found its peace, its shadow fading into the earth, becoming part of the valley's eternal watch, a presence unseen, yet forever bound to the land it had once guarded with such sorrow and devotion. As he walked further from the valley's edge, the world around him seemed to shift, taking on a sharper clarity he hadn't noticed before. The colors of the forest were richer, the air somehow fresher, as if his senses had been dulled by the valley's darkness and were only now returning to life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, dappled shadows that moved gently with the breeze, whispering a quiet welcome back to the world he had almost left behind. Yet, despite the warmth of the sun on his face, a chill lingered within him, a remnant of the valley's grasp that hadn't entirely loosened. He could still feel the weight of the locket pressing against his chest, a cold reminder of the encounter that had changed him. His fingers drifted to it instinctively, brushing against the metal as he walked. It was an ordinary enough locket now, no longer pulsing or vibrating with dark energy, yet it seemed to carry an indelible memory of the valley and the creature's sorrow. A question hung heavy in his mind, unspoken yet relentless. Why had he been the one to find the locket, to face the valley's secrets? He hadn't sought out such a burden, and yet it had fallen to him. The valley had chosen him, pulled him in with an invisible thread, and left him marked by its ancient mysteries. Part of him felt a strange sense of purpose, as though he had been entrusted with a story, a secret meant to be remembered and perhaps even passed down, to prevent others from falling into the valley's trap. The forest grew sparse as he continued on, and soon he found himself at the edge of a familiar path, leading back toward the small village he had left days before. It felt strange, almost surreal, to see the world of the living again, vibrant and ordinary, so different from the timeless, shadowed realm he had escaped. As he approached the outskirts, he saw familiar landmarks, the old stone wall, the weathered oak tree, the narrow trail winding through patches of wildflowers. Each detail grounded him, reminding him that he was truly back. He spotted a figure standing by the edge of the road, watching him. It was the old man from the village, the one who had warned him before he set out, his eyes sharp, yet filled with an unspoken understanding. The man nodded as he approached, his gaze drifting briefly to the locket hanging from his neck before meeting his eyes. "You've returned," the old man said quietly, his voice laced with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Few do." He nodded, unsure how to respond, the weight of his experience settling around him like a heavy cloak. The old man's gaze lingered, as if searching for some sign, some indication of what he had seen, but he said nothing further, only gesturing for him to follow. They walked in silence toward the village, the only sounds the faint rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds overhead. Once they reached the edge of town, the old man stopped and turned to him, his expression grave. "You carry its mark now," he said, nodding toward the locket. "That valley has secrets older than any of us. It chooses who enters, and it chooses who leaves. But the ones who leave, they don't come back empty-handed." He nodded again, feeling the truth of the man's words deep within him. He could still feel the valley's pull, faint but persistent, a reminder that he now carried a part of its story, its curse, within him. It was a weight that he understood he would bear for the rest of his days, an unspoken bond that tied him to the valley's dark heart. "I saw it," he murmured, barely able to voice the words. The creature, it wasn't just a monster. It was bound. The old man's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. "A guardian, once, and a prisoner. The valley doesn't let go of its own easily," he said. "But you've been granted a rare mercy, though you'll carry its memory. That locket, it's yours now, and all that comes with it." He nodded, accepting the weight of the responsibility, understanding that the locket was not just a relic, but a reminder, a testament to the valley's mysteries, its tormented past, and the lives it had claimed. He would be its keeper now, not bound by chains, but by memory, by respect for the ancient force that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. As he looked back down the path toward the valley, a strange sense of peace settled over him. The shadows he'd walked through, the horrors he had faced, they were a part of him now, woven into the fabric of his soul. And though he might never return to that place, he knew he would carry its story, its burden. As quietly and reverently as the valley had asked of him, the creature was free, and perhaps in a way so was he. He spent the next few days in the village, moving through its simple routines with a quiet, detached presence. Though he kept mostly to himself, the villagers seemed to sense the change in him, their gazes lingering a bit longer when they passed him uh, in the street, whispers trailing after him like the remnants of the valley's mist. No one asked him about his journey or the locket he now wore, yet it was clear they all knew where he had been and what it meant. In the evenings, he would sit alone by the village's edge, gazing toward the distant tree line, where the valley lay hidden beyond hills and thick stretches of forest. The locket was always cool against his chest, its weight a subtle reminder of the task he'd been entrusted with. He could feel it thrumming faintly, as though the valley's memories were stirring within it, echoing across the distance, carried on invisible threads that bound him to that dark place. Despite his newfound freedom, he knew the valley was never truly far from him. One night, as he sat beneath a sky blanketed with stars, the old man from the village approached him once more, his footsteps soft against the dirt. Without a word, he settled beside him, his gaze turned toward the horizon where the trees swallowed the valley's secrets. They sat in silence for a time, the stars flickering overhead, their light sharp and cold, indifferent to the mysteries below. "You know," the old man finally spoke, his voice low, "it's said that the valley chooses its own, that only those with the strength, or perhaps the burden, to understand it are drawn there." He glanced at him, his eyes sharp in the dim light. "But once chosen, you're never quite the same." He nodded slowly, absorbing the man's words. "It's hard to describe," he said, voice thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. "The valley, it's like it holds everything. Memories, sorrows, fears. They linger there, woven into the trees, the stones, the shadows. It was as if it wanted me to know it, to understand the pain bound within it." The old man looked thoughtful, nodding in silent agreement. "The valley keeps its guardians close, even after they're gone. The creature, I think it was grateful, to be seen, to be understood. Not many would look past the terror of its form to see the sorrow beneath." The image of the creature's eyes, filled with that strange, haunting gratitude, flashed in his mind. There had been a bond between them, forged in those final moments, an unspoken acknowledgement that transcended fear. The creature had been more than a monstrous presence. It had been a soul caught between duty and suffering, waiting for release. And though it was gone, its essence lingered with him like an imprint, a reminder of what lay within the valley's depths. He drew the locket from beneath his shirt, watching it catch the starlight, the faint carvings barely visible in the darkness. "Sometimes I think I can still feel it," he murmured, as if the valley isn't done with me yet, like there's something I'm meant to carry forward." The old man placed a steady hand on his shoulder, his grip warm and grounding. "Perhaps that's true. The valley doesn't release its guardians lightly. It leaves a mark on all who survive it, a reminder, a warning." He paused, his gaze fixed on the locket. "But perhaps it's also a gift, a chance to honor those who came before, to carry their stories. Not many have the courage to face such things, let alone carry them forward." He sat in silence, absorbing the man's words, feeling the weight of what he carried shift within him. The valley's memories, its secrets, they were not just burdens, but also echoes of lives that had once walked the same path, souls who had been bound to the same duty. By surviving, he had become part of a legacy, a quiet custodian of the valley's history, its darkness, and perhaps even its redemption. After a time, the old man rose, giving him a final nod before disappearing into the shadows of the village. Left alone, he held the locket in his hand, feeling the faint pulse that still beat within it, steady and quiet, like a distant heartbeat. He closed his eyes, letting the memories of the valley wash over him, embracing the weight, the sorrow, the peace. It was his now, a silent bond that connected him to the valley's dark beauty, its secrets entrusted to him alone. The night stretched on, the stars watching over him, silent witnesses to his vigil. He thought of the creature, of the souls bound within the chasm, of the whispers that had haunted him, and strangely comforted him. He understood now that he would always carry them, not as chains, but as threads woven into the fabric of his being. The valley was his shadow, his silent companion, a piece of him as constant and essential as his own heartbeat. As dawn approached, the first hints of light painting the sky in muted grays and pinks, he rose, feeling the cool morning air brush against his skin. He turned toward the valley one last time, a quiet vow forming within him. He would remember. He would honor its legacy, not with words or grand gestures, but with quiet reverence, a respect for the ancient forces that shaped him. And with that, he turned back toward the village, the locket resting heavily yet peacefully against his chest, its weight now familiar, comforting, a testament to what he had faced, to what he had survived. The valley's shadows were behind him, yet he knew that its memory, its essence, would walk with him always, a silent presence etched into his soul. As he returned to the village under the first light of dawn, the world felt newly awakened, each detail vivid and alive, as though the valley's dark influence had peeled back a layer, revealing a deeper clarity. The early morning mist hung low over the rooftops, curling around the old stone paths and blending with the soft hues of the sunrise. He walked slowly, his steps thoughtful, each one grounding him further in the present, pulling him back from the shadows of the past few days. The villagers were beginning to stir, their doors creaking open as they greeted the morning with quiet, habitual rituals. Some of them glanced his way, nodding with silent acknowledgement, their expressions neither pitying nor curious, but respectful, as if recognizing something sacred in his journey. He had expected questions or perhaps a curious word or two, but no one approached him. They understood, in their own way, that the valley's mysteries were not to be spoken of lightly. Here, the unspoken carried more weight than any question could. He continued along the path until he reached the edge of the village, where a modest stone chapel stood, partially hidden beneath ancient oak trees. It had stood there for centuries, weathered yet steadfast, a silent witness to the lives and losses of those who called the valley home. Drawn by a quiet instinct, he entered, finding solace in the dim, cool air within. The locket felt warm now, a gentle weight against his chest, as if it too recognized the sacredness of the place. He found a simple pew near the back and sat down, closing his eyes, letting his mind drift to the valley one last time. He could feel the presence of those who had come before him, the guardians and souls bound to that ancient chasm, their memories woven into the valley's mist, their whispers now part of him. He felt a bittersweet peace settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the responsibility he carried. He wasn't just bearing the valley's secrets, he was safeguarding the memory of those who had lived and lost themselves within it. Opening his eyes, he took the locket from his neck, holding it in his hands. He could see the symbols more clearly now, faint but intricate, etched with purpose. It was a reminder, a connection, a silent testament to the valley's hold on him. He thought of the creature's final, grateful gaze, the relief that had softened its tortured features in those last moments. Whatever it had been, whatever it had endured, it was free now, and so was he. With a deep breath, he laid the locket on the wooden pew beside him, leaving it there as an offering, a tribute to the valley and its mysteries. He didn't need to carry it anymore. The weight of the memories was enough. The locket was merely a symbol, one that belonged in a place of reverence, a quiet anchor for the souls still bound to that ancient place. He felt a lightness as he let it go, a sense that the valley's hold on him had softened, allowing him to move forward unburdened. He left the chapel, stepping back into the morning light. The village was fully awake now, its humble activity a comforting reminder of the ordinary, a world he was grateful to rejoin. As he walked through the streets, he felt something new within himself, a sense of purpose not tied to the valley's darkness, but to the clarity it had given him. He would live differently now, with a reverence for the mysteries he had glimpsed, a respect for the forces beyond understanding. Days passed, and the memories of the valley grew softer, settling with him like quiet embers. He took up small tasks around the village, finding peace and simplicity in work done with his hands, in conversations spoken without weight or pretense. He understood now that he had been given a gift, one that would live within him, shaping his actions, his thoughts, guiding him in ways subtle yet profound. The villagers never spoke of the valley, yet he noticed a change in the way they regarded him, a quiet respect that went beyond words. He became, in his own way, a part of the village's legacy, his presence a gentle reminder of the valley's mysteries, a silent testament to the unseen world that shaped their lives. He didn't need to explain or recount what he had seen. His survival alone spoke volumes, his return a quiet victory over shadows. Years later, as he grew older, he would often find himself walking the paths that led to the valley's edge, stopping just before the forest grew dense, where the light began to fade into shadow. He would linger there, gazing into the trees, feeling the familiar pull, the silent call of the place that had once nearly claimed him. But he never crossed back into the valley. He knew his role now was as a keeper of memory, a guardian not bound by chains, but by choice. And when he finally left this world, his story became part of the village's quiet lore, a tale passed down in hushed tones. It's a story of a man who had ventured into the valley's depths and returned forever changed, carrying with him a piece of its ancient, haunted heart.